Hello everyone, it's Mostrino here, and we're here, the final video of all of these kind of mix contest tip kind of videos for mixing and mashing and transitions and whatnot. Although I might, again, like I mentioned in the first video, I might add another one. If there's a good deal of things that I missed or things that I should have gone into more detail about, I'll add another one. But if that doesn't happen, then yeah, this is the last one. And like I mentioned in the last video, and as you can probably tell by the title, it's miscellaneous tips. It's just everything that I've wanted to cover and that I've thought of covering that I didn't cover in any of the previous videos. So let's just get right into it. The first thing is something that Rocket Man had mentioned in his Learn to Mix streams when he was breaking down the demo mixes, which is the advantages of sing-along mixes, as he calls them. Basically when you have, a lot of vocal content in your mixes. And I definitely think that this is a good tip because, especially if the person listening recognizes the vocals, keeping the vocals in there will help to keep the listeners engaged. Because when there's a vocal playing, it's much easier for us to pay attention versus an instrumental track, which, might lose us a little bit. And this is something that I employed both in my KOC mix and in my mix contest submission. I'm not going to show the examples of the KOC mix since it's an hour-long mix and it would take a long time, but let's just take a look at the mix contest submission over here. So right from like 5 seconds in, we've already got some vocals playing. The whole intro, we've got vocals. And then in this first section, we bring in the Dreamers acapella. And the Signs acapella. And then in this transition, we have Signs acapella playing as well. And then over here, we bring in Souvenir. So every single section so far in the first 2.5 minutes of the mix has had vocals. And in fact, every single section in the entire mix, aside from some of the drops, is going to have vocals. Like, for example, this drop, as you know, doesn't have any vocals in it. Because, I mean, it's not really a place where you would need to have vocals there, right? It just can function as a drop. But then right after it, we go back into the vocals, this time for Potions. Sipping on a little something, I've been sipping too much. And then again in this next section, we don't have any vocals there because it's a drop and we don't need them. And we don't have any vocals in this build-up section since it's so short, it's just like some 10 seconds long. And then, while we don't really have proper lyrics during this side trance drop, I do bring in the little vocal sample from Us by Snouse. And I think even just that little bit can help get people engaged versus if that wasn't in there. Then right after it, we go into more vocals, this time from Superhuman. Everything is new in love. It's just to see if and we keep the Superhuman vocals going into this next section. And still bleed, 'cause with you And then in this next section, we still keep it with the vocals, this time the Build the Cities acapella. And then here, not too much vocal prevalence because we're going into a bit of a drop, but we still have the vocals from There For You Now by Nigel Good. And then right after, we still keep it with the vocals, this time from Get On Up.
Can you feel it? Can you feel it?
And of course, as we looked in the previous video, here we bring in the vocals from Anywhere You Go. So notice how throughout the entire mix, almost every single section has vocals, and I can guarantee that if those vocals weren't there, you know, it would be a lot harder to stay engaged with the mix, and, you know, a lot easier to not pay as much attention to it. Keeping those vocals in there, especially vocals that people can recognize and, you know, follow along with them, is going to be a very good way to make sure people stay engaged with your mix. So that's definitely something that I would say is worth doing. You don't have to necessarily have vocals in every single section, but try and see what are parts where people might not seem that engaged with the mix, and see if throwing in a vocal in that spot can help keep people's attention a little bit better. Now these next like 4 tips are all having to do with transitions, some of those transition tips that I didn't mention in the transition tips video. This first one is still on the topic of vocals though. It's the usage of vocals and acapellas to make your transitions smoother. And I did this quite a bit in my KOC mix as well, but I'm just going to show the mix contest examples because I think with just those it'll kind of suffice to show what I'm talking about. So this is the first example that I'm going to go ahead and play for you guys. So here, what we're using is the Signs acapella, slapping that one over the transition, making it a bit more reverbed. You can hear we're bringing in the reverb. And this really helps to cover up the transition, because the thing is with the vocals, that's usually the main thing that is drawing people's attention. So this is kind of, you know, doing 2 things at once. Not only is it keeping people engaged with the mix, but it's also taking people's attention away from the transition that's actually happening, which makes the transition feel smoother than it actually is. Because if I play the transition without the acapella, first of all, notice how without the acapella, suddenly the mix completely loses all the flow and the momentum that it had going for it. Suddenly it feels like there's nothing to capture your attention here, and that this transition kind of feels like a bit of a dead zone. Take a listen.
How did we fall?
Like, that just feels like it drags on for way too long, and it feels way too empty, and it really just feels like it's throwing off everything that the mix had going for it already. But when I bring back the vocals, suddenly it flows and feels much more smooth, and it doesn't feel like it drags on too long because you're able to stay engaged with those vocals.
How did we fall?
The other transition in this mix where I used that technique, that trick, is this one over here that I'm gonna play right now. So for this one, it's the Build the Cities acapella that's keeping your attention here. And you can hear when I take that one out. First of all, it's going to have the same effect as in the previous transition, where suddenly this transition feels way too long and way too boring. But also, you're going to be able to notice Therefore You Now coming in and Magnolia coming out much more easily. The transition doesn't feel nearly as seamless because you're actually hearing what's happening instead of the vocals taking away your attention and drawing you away from the transition. And again, it just it completely kills the flow of the mix. It feels like it's dragging on way too long. And you can clearly hear me bringing Therefore You Now in and Magnolia out. And it feels much rougher of a transition than when we have the vocals covering it up. So, especially if you have longer transitions, but usually just for transitions in general, if you have an acapella that you can throw in there cleanly, because you don't want to have the acapella feel forced, like have it feel out of place in the transition. I feel like something with this, especially with the usage of the reverse reverb and having it stick around for so long, and especially for Signs, since I had already had the Signs vocal playing from before, the acapellas didn't feel out of place. So if you can have an acapella where it doesn't feel out of place and you can use that on your transition, that'll be a great way to, again, do both of keeping people's attention, making the transition not feel as long as it is, but also making the transition feel smoother than it is because people are focusing on the vocal. That's kind of what we're gravitating towards. So that's the first tip. The second tip that I wanted to talk about for these transitions is using tracks for the purpose of filling out the transitions. So I feel like something that especially a lot of people that are newer to mixes kind of tend to think is that if you throw a track into the mix, people have to be able to tell that it's there. But I have a ton of tracks in this mix where basically no one would be able to pick up on the fact that they're there. And I wouldn't expect them to know that they're there either, because the purpose of me including these tracks isn't for the sake of you thinking, oh wow, that's that track that I recognize, but rather just for a purely functional purpose of filling out the mix. For example, as you can see in this first transition, I have here Crossroad by AU5. From that really ambient intro, and I have No Sleep by Boss Fight. Again, just using the ambient bits, and like I mentioned, I don't think anyone will be able to notice that these are there, but you can definitely hear the difference between when they're there and when they're not there. Here's when they're there.
How did we fall? When we are all we've got. We are all we've got.
And then here's when they're not there.
How did we fall? When we are all we've got. We are all we've got. When
Notice how the transition suddenly feels significantly emptier. These two tracks that nobody would know are in the mix make a massive difference on these transitions. And I feel like this is one of the most overlooked parts of transitioning, is that really sometimes your transitions, you really need to fill them out. And using tracks like these, taking ambient sections, feels unintuitive. It feels like it doesn't make sense because people wouldn't even be able to notice that the tracks are there. But if it makes the transition sound better, then it makes the transition sound better. So it would be in your interest to do it. And I did that outside of transitions as well throughout the mix. A ton of other tracks that I threw in here. For example, in this intro, I've got Down into the Sumerian Depths, a track from the Silk back catalog. Sounds like this. Very ambient. And I even include it in the anticipation mashup. The other one that I include in the intro is Nostalgia by Vintage and Morelli, just to give a little bit more of a vinyl sound and again, really fill out the intro. Again, another Silk back catalog track in those pads at the end, filling things out, because without these, you can definitely hear the difference. If I go ahead and play the intro. Notice how much of that atmosphere you lose once I take these tracks away. Tracks, again, I should mention that nobody's going to notice that they're there unless they really know the tracks. Suddenly, it feels so much emptier. Another spot where I did a bit of that is in this portion where I'm playing the Potion, Slander, and Boss Fight remix, because I didn't want to just be playing a track by itself. Because I mean, you've heard tracks by themselves before. That's not necessarily unique to my mix. So by throwing in these two other tracks from the Silk back catalog, again, I'm filling it out. Here's how it sounds with them both in there.
someone like you. I never felt this way, felt this way.
Now here's how it would sound if I didn't include those tracks in here.
Met someone like you. I never felt this way.
pretty big difference, isn't it? And if I go ahead and go into these tracks, here's how Fluorescent sounds like. Again, just kind of filling things out. Same thing with Into the Dark. And they kind of play off each other very nicely. And throwing these in kind of adds an extra layer of depth and complexity to the mix that you can really appreciate if you know the songs that are being used. And again, they work very nicely with the Potions remix.
Someone like you. I never felt this way, felt this way.
So then again, when you go ahead and listen to the Potions remix, it's like, wait a minute, this doesn't sound the same as it did in the mix. And then it's just another way to make your mix more unique, but also, as I talked about with the earlier examples, it can also just make the mix better, right? Sometimes things just sound too empty, and if you throw in some of these tracks, even if people aren't even going to notice that they're there, if they're filling things out, then that's going to be absolutely in your favor to throw these in and to make those transitions and those sections sound much more full. So now this next tip, again, it's one of those more miscellaneous ones because it only applies in specific circumstances, but I think it's a good one to know. So basically, if you're going from a vocal track to a drop switch, or switching up the drop, it can make the transition sound much smoother if you keep the line from the original track playing during the drop. And in case that doesn't make any sense, let me just play this example and then I'll tell you what I'm talking about. So what I mean by this is it makes the transition a lot smoother to have this vocal keep on playing throughout the drop. Don't worry about the little effects there. And yeah, there's no official acapella for this track as far as I'm aware, so I was just using Melody ML, and of course the quality isn't great, but since Light of Mine has such a busy first drop, you can't really notice the artifacts that much when they're played together. But listen to the difference for when I don't actually keep the vocal playing anymore, and you can hear that you lose a bit of that smoothness when you don't keep the vocal playing throughout the drop. Right, like it's not necessarily bad, but it just sounds so much more satisfying and so much smoother when you can keep the vocal line playing for a little bit. Besides, it helps, again, contribute to the uniqueness of the mix, because otherwise, this is just Light of Mine's drop. You can listen to that wherever, whenever. But when I throw in the vocals, not only is it unique because of the transition, but it's also unique because it has the vocals on top of the drop, which you're not going to be able to hear anywhere else. So again, this isn't necessarily a case that you might encounter too often, but if you're doing some drop switches and you see the opportunity to do something like this, I would say definitely go ahead and try it out, because you can hear how much smoother things sound like when, again, you keep that vocal playing. The final transition tip that I want to talk about is that it can really help your transitions if you tease tracks before they come in. So I'm going to go ahead and play this transition and talk a little bit about that. And I did play this last time, but last time we were focusing on the melody matching. This time I want us to actually focus on the actual transition.
When you hurt me, see my world revolve around you, but I'm nothing. But I'm better off without you. Yeah, I'm better off without you. Yeah, I'm better off without you. Without you.
So even though these tracks were in the same BPM, I think, or at least really close in BPM, and they were in the same key, I knew that this mashup over here was very different in style from Without You. You know, Without You being a lot more poppy, a lot more kind of like feel good, whereas this mashup's, you know, much more on like the bass heavy side, a lot more dramatic. And I knew that that mood switch could be kind of jarring, which is why I wanted to make the transition as clean as possible. So what I did over here is I took a snippet from the mashup and I put a bunch of reverb on it and I put some filters on it, brought the volume up to kind of smoothly hint at the fact that this mashup is coming, so that when it actually comes in, it doesn't completely catch you off guard. Here's how this sounds. And the other thing that I did to smooth out the transition a little bit more was I included a little bit of Without You's drop so that it didn't just cut out right away. And without both of those things, the transition would have sounded like this.
See my world revolve around you, but I'm nothing. But I'm better off without you. Yeah, I'm better off without you. Yeah, I'm better off without you. Without you.
It's not the worst, but it definitely sounds much smoother with these extra elements in here.
See my world revolve around you, but I'm nothing. But I'm better off without you. Yeah, I'm better off without you. Yeah, I'm better off without you. Without you.
So again, if you ever find yourself in a situation where the transition, you know, maybe it's a really drastic mood switch or something, if you can tease in the track beforehand, you know, if you can tease it in smoothly, it can definitely help make that transition feel much more natural. That's all really that I wanted to talk about in terms of those more niche and specific transition tips. The next thing that I'm going to touch on really briefly is mastering your mix. So I asked some of the other 2021 finalists how they mastered their mix, and none of them were doing anything too crazy. Usually it's just some sort of limiter, compressor, maximizer on the master. The one that I use for all my mixes is Ozone 9 Elements. Isotope gave this one out for free during a sort of promotion. But if you don't have this one, you know, maybe you can try the Fruity Limiter, or maybe there's some third-party limiter that you find that's really good, and you can work with those, right? But really, the main thing is just making sure that things don't hit the limiter too hard, but also you don't want them to not hit the limiter hard enough either. You've got to find that kind of right balance. And part of that just kind of comes with practice and, you know, getting your ears more accustomed to what works and what doesn't. But of course, you can ask people for feedback, ask them, you know, does this sound too compressed, not compressed enough? And you can kind of hear what they're thinking as well. So let's just take a look at how things are hitting the limiter with this one. Really, this is just doing a little bit of light work on those peaks from the drums and from some of the synths. If we take a look at this mashup, this was a mashup I made in another project file. So really, we wouldn't want it to be affected by the limiter much at all, since I already limited it in the other project file. And notice how, aside from these little bits of Without You, when the mashup's playing by itself, the limiter isn't touching it. I have it set up so that it's hitting at exactly the right volume, where it's at the maximum loudness before the limiter starts acting. And again, during this section where I just have Saviors playing by itself, when you have a track playing by itself, that track's already got all of its mastering, all its limiting done. So you're not going to want to do any more limiting on it than it has already. So since this track's playing by itself, you'll notice that I've got it right at the threshold of the limiter, but the limiter's doing either barely anything to it or nothing to it. So those are kind of the big takeaways. Again, you don't have to do anything super fancy. Just find, you know, a limiter or compressor that you know is really reliable and is going to give you good results. And just make sure that you're not pushing things too much, because I can show you if I turn the threshold up, it gets too quiet. And if I turn the threshold down, it gets too compressed. You definitely don't want something like that. And I know for people who are not super familiar with kind of mastering and whatnot, it might be hard to hear the difference. That's just because Ozone is good. Like, really the main reason why it's hard to hear the difference is because you can push Ozone much farther than probably like the stock limiter before you can really hear some problems with it. But if I turn the character down, for instance, you'll definitely hear the difference. Right, and now that just sounds like it was meant as like a distortion meme or something, right? Like, you definitely don't want that. And if I turn the character way up, then it sounds really compressed. So it's about finding the right balance, and again, depending on what plugin you're using, the right knobs that you're going to want to tweak are going to be different from plugin to plugin. So you're going to have to look into that yourself. But really the main takeaways is make sure it's not hitting it too hard, and make sure it's hitting it hard enough. On that note, when it comes to mixing and mastering with your mixes, something that I would definitely recommend is try listening to your mix on as many sound systems as possible. You know, on your headphones, on speakers, maybe your phone speaker. Something that I've noticed even is that my headphones on my computer sound different from my headphones in my phone. So it might be something to look at as well. But if you listen on all these different speakers, the way that speakers present sound varies from speaker to speaker. When you can listen on all of these different sound systems, it makes it much easier to figure out what parts of your mix might be too loud or might have too much high end or too much low end, and really be able to dial those things in. I know even for me, during this kind of series, there were definitely some moments where I was dialing things in for the video and it sounded all right to me, but then when I go back to edit the video on my speakers rather than on my headphones while I'm recording, I notice, oh yeah, that this is too harsh here, or I should have pushed this up more here. So listening on multiple sound systems is definitely going to be very useful for hearing what things need to be dialed in. The other thing that I want to talk about really quickly, this is a bit of an FL tip, which is these arrangements that they added. And this can be a really good way to test different mashup and transition ideas. You can see I'm on arrangement 3 here. If we go to arrangement 2, I've got these other ideas that I threw in here. I have not gone into these arrangements in over a year, by the way, so I have no idea how these are going to sound. So they probably sound pretty terrible, but I mean, might as well play them just for fun. I mean, I suppose it could be worse. Let's see what arrangement 1 has. So you can see that I'm using these different arrangements to test different mashup ideas, and then I kind of stick with the one that I like the most. Because what's really nice is you can go ahead and clone an arrangement, and now it's like, okay, what if in this arrangement I want to do all this wacky chopping, right? And then I go back into arrangement 3, and this is all perfectly normal. So it's a really, really neat way for FL users. I don't know how it is in other DAWs, but at least for FL, if you want to test different transition ideas, but you're worried about maybe it's not working, just clone your arrangement. That way, if the idea turns out to not be it, you can just go back to your other arrangement and you're good to go. So that's something that I would definitely recommend, because I feel like that's just really nice to kind of mess around with your ideas without having to have the stress of messing up your project. Now, I'm probably going to be on this screen for a while because these next couple tips are more just tips that I'm telling you rather than things that I'm showing you. I don't really need to do anything in FL for these ones. For example, this next tip, I mean, maybe a bit of a simple one, but follow the instructions, right? At the time of recording this, the mix contest for 2022 has not been started yet. I have no idea what the required tracks are. I have no idea what any of the requirements are, any of the instructions or whatnot. But it's always a good idea to follow the instructions, right? Making sure your mix is the right length, making sure, again, of course, you're using the required tracks, and that you're following all the other guidelines that they put out for you. I know it's a pretty simple tip, but might as well put it out there, right? Because that's not something you're going to want to be forgetting. On the topic of required tracks, something that's going to be really important in making you stand out and giving you a good shot at getting selected as a finalist is making the required tracks unique to your mix. I know Rocket Man had talked about this one a lot as well, because everyone's going to be using these tracks. So how can you make them stand out for you? For me, for instance, as we looked at in my mix contest submission, with Dreamers, I did the vocal chops, and with Souvenir, I did the vocoding, completely kind of flipping it right before going into that drop switch. If you can find things like these to do with your required tracks that you know nobody else is going to be doing, that's going to be extremely effective in getting people's attention and making your mix stand out from the crowd. On the topic of length, because again, you're going to want your mix to be a certain length, and something else that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to show off everything that you can do. So pacing is going to be really important, because again, you want to display your abilities, but you have to keep the mix a certain length. One example, which I know Rocket Man did in the, I believe it was the 2020 demo mix, that ended with Ocean Eyes, is the Ocean Eyes drop was just taking too long, so he decided to cut it and then just kind of go into the outro so he could end the mix. And he cut it in a way where it felt really smooth, and he was able to keep the mix the right length. You know, feeling free to chop around tracks or, you know, shorten some transitions, shorten some sections to keep your mix the right length is definitely going to be wise, because you definitely don't want to have any sections that drag on for too long. You're going to want to keep the mix going from section to section, showcasing your ability to do these kind of transitions. So pacing is definitely something you're going to want to keep in mind. Something else that I said I would talk about here is what tracks can you use and what tracks can't you use. I know especially last year and the year before, where it's like, wait a minute, there are tracks we can't use, but they're not really telling us what tracks they are, and you know, it can get really frustrating, right? Figuring out, what if I have this whole mashup that I'm really proud of and it turns out that I can't use the track? Well, I can tell you, at least from my experience, what they did was, okay, they accepted the finalists regardless of if you use tracks that weren't allowed or not. Like, if you use tracks that aren't allowed, at least I believe that they don't count that against you. But what they do is, once they tell you that you're a finalist, there's like, okay, here are all the tracks you can't use. It's going to be your responsibility to go through the mix and make sure you're not using any of them. But again, what if you have a mashup that you spend a ton of time on, and maybe it's even like a 2-track mashup, and one or if you're really unlucky, both of those tracks are tracks that you can't use. You're gonna have to redo that whole section in just like a few days to be able to get the final mix in and get those, you know, illegal tracks out. It would be so much nicer if you just knew which tracks weren't allowed ahead of time so that you didn't run into that problem. So here I'm gonna give you some tips to hopefully make it a little bit easier to tell which tracks are or aren't allowed. First of all, if you see a track like this where you're not allowed to download it, you know with 100% certainty you are not allowed to use that track in your mix. If you can't download it from the website, you cannot use it. So that hopefully should already clear up some tracks, because there are quite a few tracks like that. Something else, you might notice some tracks don't show up in the search. Like if I search up Nelio, there are no tracks. If I search it up here, there are no tracks. That's just because the search is broken. The tracks are actually still on the website. If you click this Nelio artist profile, you can see all of these tracks are here. However, there are some tracks that aren't on the website at all. There were some other tricks that I was going to talk about on how to find tracks that you can't use, but a lot of them don't work anymore now that they've changed the search. So I'm just going to have to tell you, like for example, a big red flag would be if the tracks aren't in Monstercat's playlist. I wouldn't be surprised if there are a few innocent ones that just kind of got left out, but I know like all the Arrow Chord tracks aren't on there anymore, all the Riot tracks aren't on there anymore. Those kind of things where if you can see a pattern there, it's probably a red flag. Another one that they had talked about before is the Shock One album. Not It's All Over, but A Dark Machine, because that one was co-signed with Warner, so we're not allowed to use those. And again, it's sneaky, right? Because we can download these, no problem, but we can't use them in our mixes. The other thing is if we go into these releases here, and we just click on one of them, you can see at the top this URL, and this over here is the track ID. And, you know, if I just go ahead and put a random one, let's say 79. All right, works out super well. Let's do a 4-digit one, right? 1008. Everything is all good. However, there are some that don't show up. And now I should warn you, just because the track doesn't show up, just because the URL doesn't show up, doesn't automatically mean that you're not allowed to use it. I've noticed some innocent ones, or some that I'm pretty sure are innocent at least, not showing up on here, so it's probably just some errors with the website. But to save you the time for searching through all of them and having to do some guesswork, I'm just going to share the ones that I know for sure we cannot use and don't show up on there. And also the Arrow Chord IDs don't show up either, but I'm just going to skip those since I've already talked about him. So if we go right ahead, I'll start with the singles first. MCS 007. That's House by Overwork. Shouldn't be surprising to anyone that you can't use that one. 014 also doesn't show up. That's I Remember by Tristram. 068, that's Truth by Tristram. 098, that's Famous by Archie. 107, Flight by Tristram and Braken. 153, Synergy by Haywire. 163, Back and Forth by Haywire. 185, Till It's Over by Tristram. 216, Frame of Mind by Tristram and Braken. 250, Ever Changing by Haywire. 289, My Friend by Tristram. And 307, Insight by Haywire. And some of these tracks do still show up on the website. They are still on the website because they're part of compilations and whatnot, but the individual releases have been removed. Now let's take a look at EPs. We've got 004, Smashing Noobs by Tristram, and 026, Truth, the Remixes by Tristram. How about LPs? If we look at the first LP, that one's gone. Twofold Part 1 by Haywire. And then finally, free releases. There are a lot of other free releases that don't show up for some reason. Some of them are actually because they used to be free releases but aren't free anymore, but these ones are just because they're removed. So if we do 001, that's Inspire by Throttle. 2 is L'Esprit Noir by Varian. I'm sorry if I butchered that name. 7, that is This Is Not the End by Pegboard Nerds and Cruella. And then 13, that's Coffins by Pegboard Nerds and Mr. Wives. And then 41 is For You, Julius Drasig remix. And something that I really should mention is that there actually are a fair amount of other tracks that you can't use that don't fall into any of these categories, including some Silk Back catalog tracks that aren't allowed either. But the list is constantly changing, so I don't want to go too deep, and I also don't want to claim that I've covered everything, because there could very easily be some new tracks added to the list this season that I just wouldn't know about, or some tracks that were on the list that get taken off. So I just kind of wanted to give you at least a general idea of a lot of these tracks to hopefully reduce the frustration. But do know that there are other ones beyond these that you cannot use. But I hope that I've whittled down that number to a small enough amount to the point where the odds that you use one of those tracks is hopefully very, very low. The only other things that I wanted to talk about in terms of just some final tips as I wrap this up. First of all, this was kind of a good thing that was mentioned and discussed about when I was talking with some of the other finalists, which is feel free to just mess around with ideas without needing to finish them for your mixes and your mashups, right? If you have an idea and you just want to try it out, it's always good to get the practice in, even if you don't finish the idea or even if you don't even get close to the idea. Because, first of all, you might be able to come back to it later. But also, once you try messing around with more ideas, you find out what works and what doesn't work. So getting as much practice as you can is certainly helpful. And that's something that I think I have not done a very good job of emphasizing, is the importance of practice. These tips are hopefully going to really help improve your mixing and your mashing, but I think practice is going to be the number one thing that's going to improve your skills. Something else that I want to mention, you don't have to use each of these tips in isolation. You can try melding these tips, you can try coming up with your own kind of strategies and kind of techniques that you use that I didn't even know about, and that can be a great way to keep yourself unique and do stuff that nobody else is doing and that nobody else has seen before. So that's something that I would certainly encourage you to do, and just try and push yourself as much as you can, because I feel like that's what really makes some of this stuff exciting, is seeing how far can we push some of these mashups, how far can we push some of these mixes. Something that might be good to try would be cross-brand and cross-genre mashups. You know, integrating different brands together can definitely be a very effective way of making your mix unique. The last thing that I wanted to talk about, and this is kind of rough because there's a lot that I can say about this, but I don't know how much I should say about this, because this final kind of topic is about borrowed chords and borrowed notes. And this kind of throws in like a whole wrench into the system that was working so nicely before, because suddenly it gets so much more complex once you start realizing that there's a very big portion of Monstercat tracks that use notes outside of their respective keys, and working with those is really tricky. You don't necessarily have to avoid those, especially I would recommend if you're starting out, do avoid tracks that borrow from different keys. However, once you get into kind of really the groove of things and you get into more experience, it might behoove you to kind of know a little bit more about this borrowing and how it works. I'll speak briefly on this for now, and if you guys want me to talk more about it, then I might talk more about it. But basically, there's a great portion of Monstercat tracks that either use kind of unorthodox keys, like uncommon scales we're talking about, some harmonic minor scales, some different modes, either of major or of harmonic minor. Some use even more exotic scales, actually. And working with those can be pretty tricky. Other ones might be mostly in a certain key, say G minor, but then they use some chords from G major. The thing is when you have a track that's in G minor, or you have two tracks that's in G minor, but one of them uses chords from G major, then those G major chords can tend to clash with the other G minor track. So you're going to want to be kind of very aware of these borrowed notes, but it's tricky because especially if you're just starting out, hearing when a track is borrowing from other keys can be very difficult. So I'd say my main kinds of advice is, I think feedback's going to be the biggest one if you're kind of feeling unconfident about this. I think sending it over, and if people tell you, this doesn't really sound in key, maybe there are tracks that are using, borrowing from other keys that are throwing things off. And in some cases, there are clever ways to get around this, right? Like you can chop the track and chop out the parts that are borrowing. Or maybe you can mess around with repitching to try and get either that track in just one key, or maybe you get the other track to do some neat borrowing as well. Could be a really good way to show off your kind of advanced knowledge of the music theory going behind these tracks. But if you're just starting out, it might not be worth thinking about these things too much. So again, it's just kind of thinking about, if things don't sound right, don't just assume that it's you, right? If something doesn't sound right, then maybe you want to change out the tracks. Maybe you want to change up what you're doing, even if it's supposed to be right. Like there were a lot of times, especially when I was starting out. I remember in some of my earliest mashups, I was mashing tracks from 2 different keys, and they did sound kind of off to me, but I just kind of ignored it because it was like, well, they're listed as the same key, so it must just be me. But if you feel that the stuff sounds off, then go ahead, trust your gut, and change it. And again, there are much more complex things that we can talk about in terms of modes and how you should blend tracks together that are using unorthodox keys, but I don't know if it's really worth getting into. I mean, to be honest, I don't even know how many people are going to be watching this series of tutorials in the first place. So if it is something that I ought to talk about, then I can talk about it more. But I will just kind of leave it as a note in there, because I wanted to at least acknowledge it and talk about the fact that it's there without delving too deeply into it. Now, that is actually everything that I've lined up. Like I mentioned, this was about a year in the making, coming up with all of these different things that I wanted to talk about, assembling this giant list of all these other points that I think people should know if they want to try out for the mix contest or if they want to improve their mixing and mashing abilities. So I really, really hope this was useful. And again, if you have any questions or any things you want me to talk about, hop in the Discord. And I am really excited to hear what you all think of this. So again, I'm going to be dropping a mashup tomorrow, so stay tuned for that. I hope you guys are all excited on that. And I think that is really all. So take care, guys, and hopefully I will be seeing you.